What gives the actuality of my presentation this evening is that right now Jobbik, the far-right party in Hungary, is the second most popular political force. It's like that for a few months ago, but they are becoming quite close to the leading party, the governmental party Fidesz. So there is just around 200,000 voters distance between the current governmental force and Jobbik, and right now there are more and more questions about that. Can Jobbik become a governmental force first? If we look at the opinion polls, it doesn't seem something that we can't imagine. And second, what would happen if they would go on government? This is about the actuality of the topic. The other actuality is that a book has just been published by Routledge with the name called Transforming the Transformation, edited by Michael Minkenberg. And this book, where I wrote together with Gregor Meyer, correspondent of several German news outlets of Hungary, we wrote a chapter that is about the Jobbik-Fidesz relationship. And what we tried to explore in this chapter is that the goal of transforming the transformation, to modifying the rules of the game that were set in around 1989, 1990, during the transition. So what was the impact in this process of Jobbik, the far-right party, and how Fidesz used Jobbik as a pioneer, as a tool, how instrumentalized Jobbik in the process of modifying the institutional system. So, but first, just to setting the stage, a few graphs and data about the support of Jobbik and Fidesz. Right now, what we can see in the polls is that while the popularity of the governmental party Fidesz is on the decline due to several issues, corruption issues, problems with governance, internal scandals, and a lot more. So a falling popularity on the governmental side, and the only political force that right now can capitalize on it is Jobbik, the far-right party. The distance between them right now is only 3% among the overall electorate. Jobbik has 18% support, Fidesz has 21% support, which is quite a small gap. And the biggest left-wing opposition force, the Socialist Party, is right now, they didn't really seem to capitalize from the popularity fall of Fidesz. So right now what we can see is that the only political force that can capitalize on the decline of the support of the government is Jobbik. This is what we can see on a longer run. The Jobbik support is indicated with blue. What we can see here is that Jobbik right now has its highest support level ever. So they haven't had so many supporters so far. If we look at the distribution of the Jobbik voters among different sociological groups, what we can see is that among the youngest voters aged between 18 and 30, Jobbik became the first political force with 20% support, while Fidesz has only 16, and also among the unemployed group, which is contrary to the general wisdom, not the traditional stronghold of Jobbik. The core Jobbik electorate is rather the well-educated, rather well-off youngsters with a middle-class background. But right now what we can see is that the voters who left Fidesz, mostly from the lower income groups, and also some undecided voters and current non-voters who didn't vote on the 2014 elections, right now turning to Jobbik. So they have strengthened their positions in the low-income groups as well, and in the level of the small towns, the distance between the two parties is also quite small. So, who are the current Jobbik supporters? I think here it's useful to tell a bit about the general misconception that is that all the Jobbik voters were former socialist voters. This is a theory that you can hear quite frequently from governmental politicians and pro-governmental analyst institutions and think tanks. The problem is that this is simply not true, and it's quite easy to prove via the facts. Even in 2010, according to all the 2010 elections, when Jobbik first gained its bigger support with 15% of the votes on the national election, 17% of the votes on the national election. Most of the Jobbik supporters came from former Fidesz supporters and the former non-supporters. And what we can see right now is that 90% of the Jobbik, of voters of Jobbik who voted for Jobbik in April on the last national election are still voters of the Jobbik, while 10% of the former Fidesz supporters gravitated towards Jobbik. And 1/10 of the non-voters in 2004 would vote for Jobbik as well, and this is something that is quite a dramatic shift. What we can see in Hungary is that the only political force that is really successful in mobilizing the youngsters and mobilizing the non-voters is Jobbik. So this is the force that can channel groups into the politics that were previously inactive politically. And even according to a former poll in 2012 November, 18% of Jobbik sympathizers said they voted for Fidesz beforehand, and only 5% of them said that they voted for Jobbik. So I think the theory that is the wishful thinking of the Hungarian right, that the Jobbik gains its strength on the basis of the socialist supporters, is simply not true. And if we just see on this graph, I think it's pretty easy to see. Of course, it's just an indirect proof, not a direct proof, but when Jobbik loses, when Fidesz loses support, it's mainly Jobbik who can capitalize on that, which is also, it also makes highly unlikely that all the Jobbik voters are previous socialist voters. And even right now, what we can see is that Jobbik still has quite big room for maneuvering. The former taboos that were set by the voters and the parties against voting for Jobbik has right now collapsed. What we can see is that most of the Jobbik doesn't have stronger rejection figures according to the polls than the rest of the parties, and they still have a lot of possible supporters. 4% of the overall electorate would vote for Jobbik according to their second party preferences, and 3/4 of this group is Fidesz supporter at the moment. Half of this group is currently quite dissatisfied with the state of affairs and even the performance of the government. So what we can see again is that the biggest shift or the biggest transfer is between voters of Jobbik and voters of Fidesz. If we look at the party preferences, if we secondary party preferences, the party rejections, the picture is quite clear. On the other hand, Jobbik can be successful in even targeting the voters, the right now undecided voters who would otherwise vote for the socialists. But what we can see right now is that as the anti-governmental sentiments are becoming stronger and stronger, voters want to find the most competent, the strongest party that has the biggest chance to defeat Fidesz. For example, on the interim elections that we can see. So in short, Jobbik can capitalize even on the decline of the support of Fidesz, the governmental party, and even on the weakness of the socialist party and even the overall left-wing opposition camp that is highly divided, unable to express its political ideology and even its political principles, and not really successful in capitalizing on the popularity trust of Jobbik. Recently, the leader of the Jobbik gave an interview in a right-wing daily, Magyar Nemzet, in which he said that he would personally be afraid to govern because of that Jobbik has not prepared so much for governance, but he feels that the pressure is stronger and stronger, and he wants to prepare his party for governance. This process began a long time ago, around 2 years ago, when Jobbik decided to launch a campaign in which they modified their image from an extremist party to a moderate, centrist party, the party of the youngsters. And this campaign was pretty successful so far. We could see on the graphs that Jobbik's support has more than doubled, partially as a consequence of this campaign, and it can even grow further. The interesting thing is while Jobbik is becoming stronger and stronger, still the governmental party Fidesz doesn't seem to be concerned, in the sense that we know from background information that they are quite concerned. On the other hand, they still haven't launched a full-scale political attack against their biggest rivals. Why they, day by day, blaming the socialist and the former and the current left-wing political forces who pose a much smaller threat to their current electoral support for being responsible for all the negative things for the country. And what is the reason for that? I think the reason is twofold. First of all, it's quite difficult to target a party, to attack a party that is not really distant to you ideologically. Jobbik Fidesz in the last years didn't dedicated any effort to weaken Jobbik's support, for the simple reason that they could feel that they capitalize on the presence of Jobbik. Because while Jobbik seems to pose a threat, and they really pose a threat on the right-wing electorate and even Fidesz voters, gaining a two-thirds again in 2014 wouldn't have been possible without a divided opposition, divided even in the sense that Fidesz has two-sided opposition, one side on the left and one side on the extreme right. This is one thing. The other thing is, I think, especially in the former period, Fidesz, instead of just trying to suck away the voters of Jobbik, tried to implement some of Jobbik's policies. And the reason for that, contrary to the general analysis, the general opinion that is appears everywhere, I think the main reason for that is not that they were just afraid that their voters, Fidesz voters, will go to the far right if they don't implement their policies. But I think the main reason is that Orbán simply wanted to go into the direction that Jobbik set in a lot of issues. Not all of the issues, but let's come back to it a bit later. Okay, I will come back to it. So there is a widespread dissatisfaction with the state of the political affairs and even the transformation in Hungary. According to a poll conducted by Pew Research Center in 2009, and we can compare the results from 1991, Hungary is one of the countries where the people are the most satisfied with the state of affairs as a result of the transition. The approval of change to democracy and capitalism declined significantly with 18 percentage points from 1999 until 2009. And among the V4 countries, the perception of the change to democracy is the worst. If we look at the economic side, it's even worse. In 1991, 80% approved the change to market economy, so we're rather optimistic about the transition. But in 2009, this figure, by 2009, this figure dropped significantly with 46 to 46%. And this is, after Ukraine, the lowest in Central Eastern Europe, according to the polled countries. Why is it important? For two reasons. One is that 2009 was the year when Jobbik made his first electoral success on the EP elections with almost 15% of the votes, which was a huge surprise. According to most of the polls predicted 5 to 10% or even less, so it was a big surprise. It was the year when after a change on the government, a still quite unpopular socialist liberal government was governing, and Jobbik was quite successful in articulating the discontent and making political success out of the general negative or bad public morale. The second thing is that in Hungary, especially on the right side of the spectrum, but even on the left side, everyone wants to capitalize on the negative sentiments towards the transition, towards the market capitalism, and even towards democracy in general. What a scholar described the buyer's remorse, it's pretty widespread in Hungary, is that this is not something we wanted. And of course, we shouldn't just downplay all this opinion as mere perception. Of course, we can see a lot of sociological problems that were accelerated or deepened as a consequence of the transition. Deepening poverty, for example, and growing inequality to a level that is not really preferred by the public, and a lot more issues. But what became quite general as a result of this negative perception of the transformation is that the so-called myth of stolen transition has become quite widespread, especially on the right wing of the political scene. What is the myth of stolen transition? For those who come from Eastern Europe, I think this is a theory that can be quite familiar. This is that the transition as such didn't really happen. It was just the post-communist elites and the communist elites with the bankers, with the international financial groups, with the cooperation of some secret services of the United States, of Israel in the anti-Zionist readings, and so on, have made their deals. And what we can see right now is not a real democracy, is not a real market economy. This is just a play of the politicians and of the even stronger people behind them. And the myth of the stolen transition has become something that is, I think, was the most important driving force of policy, or the myth of the stolen transition and the sentiments behind them. So the general negative sentiments towards the system as such became the most important transformative force by 2010 in Hungary. This is a campaign billboard of Jobbik from 2010. It says 20 years for 20 years. This is the public's verdict, 20 years for 20 years. It was in 2010, 20 years, the first 20 years means 20 years after the transition. The second means 20 years in prison. So all the ones who were participated in the post-transitional political elite should send to jail. And this is simplifying a bit the message, but the message originally was not really complex neither. And it was, and the slogan as well is that the pure force, with pure force. So this is beside anti-gypsy sentiments, the anti-political, anti-establishment sentiments were the one that Jobbik could exploit most successfully via the election campaign, and I think this is the two main factors that Jobbik could capitalize on, and that Jobbik could gain its popularity on the basis on. On the other hand, it was not just Jobbik that played on these sentiments. Even beforehand, we could see that dissatisfaction with the market economy and democracy produced spectacular results on elections. In 1994, when the socialists, let's say, returned to power, because then it was really a party. Right now it's still a post-communist party, the Socialist Party, but then, back then it was, let's say, 90% composed of politicians who were active in the state socialist system before the transition. So in 1994, when after 4 years of quite unpopular government with all the differences and sufferings of the transition, the socialists could return into the power because the nostalgia towards the state socialism has increased. We can obviously see in the polls. And in Hungary, this is a very, very dangerous sentiment for the reason that before the transition, let's say especially the last decade, but the last 2 decades before the transition were the years of the so-called goulash communism, which was that in Hungary, the state socialism was a bit much less repressive, and were providing a stronger, higher living standard than for most of the countries in the post-communist region. Therefore, when people feel some problems with the current state of affairs, the quite automatic reaction to that is that nostalgia towards the state socialist system arises. And when Jobbik exploited this and other parties exploited this anti-establishment sentiments, they could also build on this post-communist nostalgia. Fidesz's claims, on the other hand, were even before the 2010 election, when they returned to power, and even in after that, is that they do a second transition. First, the Prime Minister also said that this is the correction of the transition, what goes on. And he also labeled his achievements as revolution on the ballot boxes. With a 2/3 majority of Fidesz in 2010, Fidesz was able to transform practically the overall institutional system in a way that strongly benefits their political and economic interests, with cementing people into the positions of the so-called, to the heads of the so-called independent institutions, with modifying the constitution without any referendum, or something, changing the electoral system, making a stronger media supervisory body, changing the constitutional court, and practically switching it off, while it was beforehand the most important counterbalance to governments, and so on and so on. I think you know a lot of details about it. I don't have to go into them. And what made it quite easy for Fidesz is that nobody was really liking the institutions that were set up during the transition. So the public trust towards the establishment and its institutions was so low that it made it really easy to transform the system. On this, sorry, I didn't translate it. This is the 10 electoral promises of Jobbik from 2010. What we can see is that quite a lot of promises by Jobbik were implemented by Fidesz. By these 10 promises, practically 8 of them were implemented by Fidesz. Not all of them, we can say, are typically extremist measures, such as, let's reduce the utility prices. This is not something that you can call as an essentially far-right policy, but generally this policy package, which is about that law and order policies, which is about public work instead of social benefits, which is about putting extra taxes on multinational companies, which is also about giving dual citizenship to ethnic Hungarians. So it's a package that contains anti-capitalist elements, nationalist symbolic elements, and also a very strong law and order dimension. This is quite a coherent package. And most of these measures that were promised by Jobbik were implemented by Fidesz between 2010 and 2014. We can see convergences between Jobbik and Fidesz policies in several dimensions. For example, just a quite recent example is that the government launched a campaign. Right now they don't do it that loudly, but they did it for about a month against the so-called economic migrants. The sad thing is that no economic migrants want to come to Hungary. They all want to go to other countries such as Austria, such as Germany, such as United Kingdom and elsewhere. But the government, because there was a real rise in the number of the migrants coming from Kosovo, they launched a campaign against the migrants, trying to exploit the strong anti-immigrant xenophobic sentiments on the public. It was, I think, quite fortunately, highly unsuccessful so far, for the very reason that it's true that the Hungarian population is quite strongly xenophobic, but the issue of migration is simply a non-issue. According to a Eurobarometer poll, 3% of the Hungarian population thinks that immigration is an important issue. In countries of Western Europe, this figure is about 60–70%. So I think in the countries where there are just a very small number of immigrants, it's highly difficult to launch a successful anti-immigrant campaign, and this is what the government made. But it was also something that in this rude and crude form, how the government used. The Prime Minister said, for example, that we should slam the door before all the economic immigrants, while even in the Jobbik, among Jobbik's MPs in the previous term, there was one doctor, for example, who had an immigrant background, who worked as a doctor for decades and came here for a better life, so economic migrants. So it was not a really credible campaign, and even was not a really successful campaign. But we can see several other things: dual citizenship, Trianon commemoration day. It was also issues that were raised by Jobbik and implemented by Fidesz. Eastern opening. Generally, in the first term of the governance, and even previously, yes, between 1998 and 2002, when Orbán was first on power, his government was a strongly Euro-Atlantic government with all the leaders of the diplomacy wanted to strengthening the ties with the EU and with the United States, and they were even successful in that. So Eastern opening to Russia, to Azerbaijan, to Turkey, to Turkmenistan, and a lot of other countries was not originally and essentially part of Fidesz's politics. It was rather set up and used as an official policy after they became a governmental force in 2010. While from the very beginning, it was the most important priority for Jobbik. Even in interviews around 2006-2007, Jobbik leaders said that there are three most important countries that we should open to. Russia, Turkey, and Germany. Vona says right now the same, that these are the three countries that we has to open to. And right now the government says literally the same. Orbán mentioned recently these three countries as the most crucial countries to focus on in our foreign policy strategy. Energy policy, an energy policy that is strongly based on fossils and nuclear power with a strong dependence from Russian sources. This was also essential part of Jobbik's policy. Employment policy, the public work instead of the state benefits. It was something that was raised by Jobbik much before it was appeared in Fidesz politics. And law and order rhetorics with a lot of its consequences. It is also something that Jobbik used in a quite racist framing against the gypsy crime. The government used it in a different framing without such direct reference to gypsies, but with raising similar sentiments. And at this point, I think we even have to clarify, but while we can see a lot of similarities and more similarities between Jobbik and Fidesz's politics, for the reason that Fidesz in the last years have rather radicalized its rhetoric, while Jobbik is trying to shift towards the center, at least on the surface. There are still very important differences between the two parties as well, and we shouldn't draw a complete equal line between the two. And I think this too is that Fidesz was never such an openly anti-gypsy and anti-Semitic party that Jobbik still is. While the leaders of the Jobbik claiming that we are not a racist, not an anti-Semitic party, every day you can hear voices from the lower levels of the party about Holocaust denial, about killing the gypsies, about horrible things, and these are the typical voices from Jobbik. And I think in Fidesz, this open racism and open anti-Semitism has never existed, and this is still a very important division line. But let's see, okay, we can claim that this is quite logical. Fidesz is afraid of losing the popularity of the public, and especially losing the popularity of their own voters. Therefore, as, let's say, Nicolas Sarkozy did beforehand, they try to adapt some of the more acceptable policies of the far right in order to channel the voters in their camp. Let's see the success of this strategy. So, Fidesz is losing support, Jobbik is on the rise. Can we say that it was a successful electoral strategy? Not so much, I think. Generally, I think the strategy of Fidesz to implementing some of the measures of Jobbik was, talking in electoral terms, was highly unsuccessful. And hopefully Fidesz will recognize it as well. But I think there is even another explanation for why why Fidesz did that. And I think it is about what Viktor Orbán described this in his infamous speech last summer, when he said that in Hungary an illiberal state should be set up, and this illiberal state respect to a given extent the individual freedoms, but are not based on the principle of human rights. And what he even said is that it was after the second victory of Jobbik last summer. What he even said is that the liberalism and free market capitalism has failed to provide better living circumstances for the people in general. Therefore, we need to change the fundamentals of the system and set the basis of the system on different principles. And these different principles are not human rights as such and liberalism and individual, but rather the nation, Christianity, and the family. And I think this was a speech that I think were quite talkative in the sense that it was the first speech in which Orbán, let's say the second speech, there was one before the 2010 election as well, but in not that open way. So in this speech, he quite openly explained, and referring to countries as models such as Russia and Turkey, that he wants to completely change the system in Hungary in a direction that is essentially illiberal. And this kind of direction is the direction that Jobbik promised to bring the country even a lot of years ago. I think what we could see in the 2010-2014 term, I think right now we have a different story, and I don't want to go into details, but right now this picture has changed, but instead of being afraid of Fidesz being afraid of Jobbik, they rather utilized Jobbik, instrumentalized them as a pioneer. Jobbik was the pioneer that opened the room and the space for new policy strategies and solutions that were practically was quite atypical. The Eastern opening is a typical thing. Before Jobbik, nobody was talking in such an open way about the necessity of open the country towards Russia and all the Eastern countries. They did it. Therefore, when Fidesz implemented these policies, it was not that unfamiliar anymore. Even in nationalism, even in transforming the institution, even in breaking some of the former taboos of market capitalism, such as equal chances to companies and freedom and all these things. These were directions that Jobbik. These were fields that Jobbik explored much before Fidesz did it. And I think Fidesz as a governmental party could capitalize on the situation that they can achieve most of the goals of their illiberal strategy that they wanted to achieve. Why they don't seem to be extreme? Because there is a party that is echoing similar voices but in much more extreme form, and this is Jobbik. Therefore, I think while in the first period Jobbik's policy seems to be a high success, Jobbik's politicians were also mentioning several times that it was Fidesz that implemented their policies. I think it was rather the victory of Fidesz in the sense that they could achieve their goals with using Jobbik as an instrument in this regard. And I think this is maybe a moment to stop, and any questions are welcome. And if you have questions about the here and now, more details about the moderate shift and so on, I'm happy to answer to them. Thank you very much.